Number 1. Brian Joseph Dorsey. On December 23, 2006, in New Bloomfield, Missouri, 34-year-old Brian Joseph Dorsey shot and murdered his 25-year-old cousin, Sarah Ann Bonney, and her 28-year-old husband, Benjamin Wade Bonney, inside their home. Earlier that evening, Dorsey had contacted Sarah seeking help while attempting to avoid gang dealers to whom he owed money. The couple picked him up from his apartment and allowed him to stay in their home for protection. They eventually went to sleep, believing he was safe with them. During the night, Dorsey retrieved a single-shot shotgun from the Bonnies' garage. He entered their bedroom while they slept. He fired one shot at Sarah, striking her in the jaw at close range. He reloaded and shot Benjamin in the right ear, murdering him instantly. After the shootings, he assaulted Sarah's body, applied bleach to parts of her body, and stole valuables from the house. Their 4-year-old daughter, Jade, who had been asleep in another room, was not harmed. The murders were discovered the following afternoon when Sarah's parents forced open the locked bedroom door and found the bodies. 3 days later, Dorsey surrendered to law enforcement and provided a confession. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In March 2008, he pled guilty, leading directly to a sentencing trial. During hearings in August 2008, he testified that he had been heavily intoxicated and claimed memory gaps about firing or reloading the gun. Family members and former coaches described him as non-violent during his youth, while the victim's family spoke about their loss. A jury unanimously recommended 2 death sentences. On November 10, 2008, he was formally sentenced to death and transferred to death row at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center. Over the following years, Dorsey filed multiple appeals, including claims of ineffective counsel and challenges to the handling of DNA evidence. All appeals were denied by state and federal courts, including the Missouri Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court. His case gained attention because more than 70 correctional officers petitioned for clemency, citing his consistent good behavior and work as a prison barber. Several jurors later expressed regret for recommending death. Governor Mike Parson denied clemency on April 8, 2024. On April 9, 2024, at 52 years old, Dorsey was executed by lethal injection after spending 18 years on death row. His final statement expressed remorse, saying, "Words cannot hold the just weight of my guilt and shame." His last meal included bacon double cheeseburgers, chicken strips, seasoned fries, and a sausage and pepperoni pizza. Number 2. Jamie Ray Mills. On June 24, 2004, in the small community of Ginn, Alabama, 77-year-old Floyd Hill and his 72-year-old wife, Vera Hill, were attacked inside their home. Their neighbor, 30 years old Jamie Ray Mills, entered the residence after asking to borrow the couple's telephone. Mills had spent the previous night using methamphetamine with his wife, Joanne, before walking to the Hills' home. The couple allowed them inside after years of casual neighborly contact. After gaining entry, Mills moved with Floyd toward the shed behind the home, while Vera and Joanne walked back toward the porch. Inside the shed, Mills struck Floyd with a machete, a tire tool, and a ball-peen hammer. Vera returned after hearing the disturbance, and Mills attacked her with the same weapons. The couple was left with severe head and neck injuries. Mills and his wife took prescription medication and $140 before leaving. Later that evening, Ginn police officer Larry Webb arrived to conduct a welfare check after relatives reported they could not reach the Hills. He discovered Floyd deceased inside the shed and Vera gravely injured. Despite medical treatment, she died on September 12, 2004, from complications related to the assault. Mills and his wife were arrested the following day. During the investigation and trial, Joanne testified that she witnessed her husband striking the couple. Jamie Mills maintained that he did not kill the Hills and argued that his wife's testimony resulted from a plea agreement. In August 2007, Mills was tried on 2 counts of capital murder and convicted. At sentencing, the jury recommended death by a vote of 11-1, and the court formally imposed the sentence. Mills showed limited reaction during sentencing and continued to assert innocence in later statements. Joanne Mills pled guilty to lesser charges in exchange for her testimony and received life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. Mills appealed repeatedly between 2006 and 2016, challenging the credibility of his wife's statements and the evidence presented. All appeals were denied at the state and federal levels. Beginning in early 2024, Mills filed additional appeals to delay his execution, none of which succeeded. After 17 years on death row at Holman Correctional Facility, Mills was executed on May 30, 2024, at 50 years old, by lethal injection. His last words expressed love for his family. His final meal included shrimp, catfish fillets, oysters, onion rings, and stuffed crab. Number 3. Kenneth Eugene Smith. Kenneth Eugene Smith was linked to the killing of 45-year-old Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett on March 18, 1988, at her home in Colbert County, Alabama. He was in his early 20s when he joined John Forrest Parker in carrying out a contract murder arranged by Elizabeth's husband, Reverend Charles Sennett Sr., who had hired Billy Gray Williams to recruit others for the crime. Smith and Parker arrived at the home after Elizabeth confirmed with her husband that they were allowed on the property. Instead of using the firearm Charles had funded, the two had used the money on hard and entered the home under the pretense of needing the bathroom. Smith initiated the assault, beating Elizabeth with a fireplace set, a walking cane, and a piece of galvanized pipe as she struggled. Parker joined the attack, and Elizabeth was ultimately stabbed 8 times with a 6-inch survival knife. Investigators later determined the home had been staged to resemble a burglary. Sheriff Ronnie May responded first, and despite attempts by medical staff, Elizabeth died at the hospital. 1 week later, Charles Sennett himself after becoming a suspect. Smith was arrested after investigators recovered stolen property from his home. He admitted involvement and was first convicted in 1989. A jury recommended death, though the conviction was overturned in 1992. In his second trial, the jury recommended a life sentence, but the judge imposed death in 1996. Smith remained calm during sentencing and maintained that his role had been influenced by others. He spent more than 28 years on death row at Holman Correctional Facility. In November 2022, a scheduled lethal injection failed when the execution team could not place IV lines. After further appeals, Alabama set a second execution using nitrogen hypoxia. On January 25, 2024, Smith ate steak, eggs, and hash browns as his final meal. Strapped to a gurney wearing a full-face mask, he stated, "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards." He was pronounced dead at 8:25 p.m. Number 4. Ivan Abner Cantu. Ivan Abner Cantu was linked to the events of early November 2000 in the northern area of Dallas, Texas, where his cousin, 27-year-old James Mosqueda, and James's fiancée, 22-year-old Amy Kitchen, were found shot to death inside their home. Cantu, who was in his late 20s at the time, had been living and working in the area and had no prior prison record. Investigators focused on him after determining that both victims had been shot at close range and that items including hard substances, cash, and personal property were missing from the residence. According to police, Cantu entered the couple's home during the night, shot both James and Amy, and removed marijuana and money. He was arrested 4 days later. At his apartment, officers recovered bloody jeans containing the victim's DNA and a key to the victim's home. A firearm later recovered from his former girlfriend's residence showed James's blood on the barrel and Cantu's fingerprints on the magazine. His then-girlfriend, Amy Bocher, told investigators that he had spoken about murdering the couple and later drove her back to the crime scene. Cantu was charged with capital murder and went to trial in Collin County roughly 1 year after the killings. A jury convicted him and recommended the death penalty. He was formally sentenced and transferred to death row at the Polunsky unit. Cantu spent more than 23 years on death row. During this period, he continued to challenge the evidence. and some jurors later expressed concern about the case, though no court overturned the conviction. On February 28, 2024, he was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. His final statement included a direct assertion of innocence, saying he did not murder James or Amy, and he offered repeated claims that the wrong person was being executed. Number 5. Willie James Pye. Willie James Pye committed his crime on November 17, 1993, in Spalding County, Georgia, at the home of his former girlfriend's partner. Pye, who grew up in a household marked by instability, entered adolescence without consistent supervision. As a young teenager, he struggled academically, later dropping out of junior high school. By his early 20s, he had already served 5 years in prison for burglary, having been arrested at age 20. Reports later described a childhood shaped by neglect, exposure to alcohol abuse, and limited emotional support. On the day of the offense, Pye went to the residence with 2 accomplices, 15-year-old Anthony Freeman and 25-year-old Chester Adams. They initially intended to commit a robbery. He carried a newly purchased .22 caliber pistol. When they found 21-year-old Alicia Lynn Yarbrough alone with her infant, the crime shifted. Yarbrough, who had previously been in an on-and-off relationship with Pye, was abducted and taken to a motel, where she was assaulted. Her jewelry was taken. Later that night, the group drove her down a rural road. Pye instructed her to lie face down and shot her 3 times, killing her. Yarbrough's body was discovered the same day. Freeman confessed, implicating both Pye and Adams. DNA evidence confirmed Pye's involvement. Pye was arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, assault, burglary, and robbery. His trial concluded in June 1996, and a jury imposed a death sentence for the murder charge. He also received 3 life terms and a 20-year sentence. Pye maintained limited statements regarding the crime, but he denied the extent of his involvement. Adams pleaded guilty in a separate proceeding and received multiple life sentences. Freeman received life imprisonment before being paroled after 24 years. Pye's attorneys later argued that his defense had been inadequate and failed to present mitigating information about his childhood, IQ of 68, and suspected fetal alcohol exposure. His death sentence was briefly vacated in 2021, but reinstated in 2022. Appeals, including a final request to the United States Supreme Court, were denied. His clemency petition was also rejected. Pye spent nearly 28 years on death row at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison. On March 20, 2024, at age 59, he was executed by lethal injection with pentobarbital. His last meal consisted of 2 chicken sandwiches, 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, potato chips, and lemon-lime sodas. He accepted a final prayer and offered no last words. Number 6. Michael Dwayne Smith. Michael Dwayne Smith committed his crimes on February 22, 2002, in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. At 19 years old, Smith was already involved with the Oak Grove Posse Gang and was wanted for several felony charges. His background showed early exposure to violence, substance abuse, and gang influence. He grew up in a neighborhood surrounded by instability, experienced abuse in childhood, and began using drugs long before adulthood. These conditions shaped his path into gang activity well before he reached his late teens. While on the run for the earlier shooting that killed 26-year-old Otis Payne Jr. in November 2001, Smith went to the apartment of Janet Moore on the morning of February 22nd. Smith, believing her son to be a police informant, forced his way inside while Moore, a 41-year-old hospital employee, was preparing for work. When he did not find the man he was seeking, he confronted Moore and shot her once in the chest. He left the residence after attempting to wipe down surfaces to reduce evidence. Approximately 1 hour later, Smith entered a convenience store where 22-year-old clerk Sarath Babu Puluru was working. Smith believed Puluru had made remarks about a deceased gang member, though this was later proven to be a mistaken identity. Smith fired multiple shots at Puluru, emptied 2 weapons, and then poured lighter fluid inside the store before setting it on fire. Pulleru died at the scene. Smith was arrested 2 days later. During questioning, he denied involvement before eventually confessing on videotape to detectives Janet McNutt and Teresa Sterling. His trial for the murders of Moore and Pulleru began in August 2003. Witness testimony and his recorded confession led to convictions for 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with robbery, burglary, and arson. A jury recommended the death penalty, and he was formally sentenced to death in October 2003. In March 2004, he was convicted separately of second-degree murder for the earlier killing of Payne and received a life sentence to run consecutively. Smith later stated that he was under the influence of drugs during the crime and interrogation and maintained that his confession was coerced. His appeals in 2007 and 2016 were rejected, including claims of ineffective counsel. He spent 21 years on death row at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. In March 2024, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board denied clemency. His final appeals to the state courts and the United States Supreme Court were rejected. At 41 years old, Smith was executed by lethal injection on April 4, 2024, at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He declined a final meal. When asked for last words, he said, "Nah, I'm good." Number 7. David Russell Hosier. On September 28, 2009, in Jefferson City, Missouri, 54 years old, David Russell Hosier entered the apartment of 45 years old Angela Yvonne Gilpin and 61 years old Rodney Dean Gilpin. The couple had recently reconciled after Angela's long relationship with Hosier ended. Later investigation showed that Angela had previously reported concerns to police about Hosier due to his messages and behavior. That morning, both Angela and Rodney were shot inside their residence. A neighbor later entered the apartment, found them unresponsive, and alerted law enforcement. Hosier had spent years in the area after serving in the United States Navy for 6 years and later working as a firefighter. He had been raised in Indiana, where his father, a state police officer, was murdered in the line of duty when Hosier was 16. He later described this event as a turning point in his life. At 19, he joined the Navy and earned a top-secret clearance in communications. He received an honorable discharge, remarried at 25, and became a father before that marriage ended 10 years later. By his early 30s, he had been hospitalized for depression with psychotic features and bipolar disorder. In the late 2000s, he suffered a stroke that caused lasting impairment. He had also served 8 years in prison after an assault conviction before his release on parole in 1997. Following the shootings, Hosier fled Missouri and drove toward Oklahoma. Police located him after issuing notices to agencies along the route. Officers arrested him without incident. Inside his vehicle, they recovered multiple firearms, including a Sten-type submachine gun believed to be the murder weapon, as well as a written note expressing anger about Angela's decision to return to her husband. Hosier was charged with first-degree murder, armed criminal action, burglary, and unlawful possession of a firearm by a felon. He pled not guilty. Trial began in late October 2013. Prosecutors proceeded only on the count involving Angela's death, though evidence of both deaths was presented. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts. During sentencing, Hosier showed limited reaction. The court adopted the jury's unanimous recommendation of death and imposed additional consecutive prison terms. He continued to deny involvement in the killings. Over the next 11 years, Hosier pursued appeals through state and federal courts, all of which were denied. He remained at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic, and Correctional Center. In February 2024, a death warrant was issued. In May, he was hospitalized for heart failure, but he was cleared for execution. He sought clemency, citing his military service and the trauma of losing his father, but the request was denied. On June 11, 2024, 69 years old, Hosier was executed by lethal injection. His final words repeated his innocence and expressed love for his family. His last meal was a New York strip steak, baked potato with butter and sour cream, Texas toast, Dutch apple pie, orange juice, and milk. Number 8. Ramiro Felix Gonzalez. On January 15, 2001, in a rural area of Bandera County near San Antonio, Texas, 18 years old, Ramiro Felix Gonzalez entered the home of 18 years old Bridget Faye Townsend. Townsend was alone at her boyfriend Joe Leal's residence when Gonzalez, who was acquainted with Leal as his drug dealer, intruded, intending to steal. Upon seeing Townsend, Gonzalez overpowered her, tied her up, and stole cash after failing to locate drugs. He then forced Townsend into his truck and drove her to his grandfather's ranch in Medina County. During the abduction, Gonzalez assaulted Townsend and subsequently fatally shot her with a hunting rifle, later abandoning her body in a field in southwest Texas. Townsend's body was not recovered until October 2002, after Gonzalez, serving a separate life sentence for a September 2001 kidnapping and assault, confessed to the murder and led authorities to the remains. Ramiro Gonzalez was born in Texas and raised by his grandparents due to his mother's severe addiction. He suffered early abuse and neglect, was allegedly assaulted as a child, and began drinking and using hard substances at the age of 11. He worked as a fence builder and welder before his arrest. School records described him as developmentally delayed despite having normal brain function. Following his confession, Gonzalez was arrested and charged with capital murder. He stood trial in Medina County in August 2006. The defense sought life imprisonment, citing Gonzalez's traumatic upbringing, prenatal exposure to drugs, and alleged brain damage, while the prosecution presented psychiatric evaluations, stating he had no major mental impairments and a high likelihood of reoffending. The jury unanimously convicted Gonzalez and sentenced him to death. Over the next 18 years, Gonzalez pursued appeals through the Texas courts and federal system, citing both procedural issues and a retraction by a medical expert who had originally testified that Gonzalez posed a continuing danger to society. Multiple stays and reprieves were granted and later rescinded, including a delay to allow Gonzalez to donate a kidney. In June 2024, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously denied his final clemency reaglist. Gonzalez had expressed remorse, wrote to Townsend's family, and stated he had found faith during his incarceration. On June 26, 2024, 41 years old, Ramiro Felix Gonzalez was executed via lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. In his final statement, Gonzalez apologized to the family of Townsend and expressed hope for their healing. His last meal consisted of chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cornbread, peach cobbler, and chocolate milk. Number 9. Keith Edmund Gavin. On March 6, 1998, in downtown center, Cherokee County, Alabama, 64 years old, Keith Edmund Gavin shot and murdered 68 years old William Clinton Clayton Jr. Clayton was at an ATM withdrawing money to take his wife out for dinner when Gavin approached him with the intention of robbery. Gavin had traveled from Chicago, Illinois with his cousin Dwayne Lamarck Meeks, who worked for the Illinois Department of Corrections. Gavin departed from the car carrying his cousin's .40 caliber Glock pistol, opened the driver's side door of Clayton's van, and shot him twice. Witnesses Larry Twilley, Ronald Baker, and Richard Henry Jr. identified Gavin as the gunman. Dwayne Meeks fled the scene out of fear. Investigator Danny Smith pursued the van, and Gavin eventually stopped, fired twice at the officer, and fled into nearby woods. Clayton was found with 3 gunshot wounds and pronounced dead upon arrival at a local hospital. 1 bullet pierced his left arm, heart, and lungs, lodging in the passenger side door, while the second struck his left hip and remained in his back. Keith Edmund Gavin was born March 30, 1960, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 12 children. He grew up in a neighborhood with prevalent gang violence and drugs. His father was reportedly strict, and Gavin dropped out of school in the 11th grade. His criminal record began in 1979 with a burglary conviction. At 21, Gavin killed 20-year-old Reginald Allen during an argument in Cook County, Illinois. Convicted of murder in 1982, He was sentenced to 34 years, serving less than 16 before being granted parole in December 1997. Following the murder of Clayton, Gavin was arrested and initially identified himself under the alias Keith Edmonds. His cousin Dwayne Meeks was briefly charged but later cleared. On November 3, 1999, Gavin stood trial in Cherokee County Circuit Court for murder and attempted murder. The jury found him guilty of both counts, and on January 5, 2000, 40-year-old Gavin was sentenced to death for the murder of Clayton and life imprisonment for the attempted murder of investigator Danny Smith. Gavin pursued multiple appeals over the following decades, arguing ineffective counsel, racial bias, and wrongful conviction. Most appeals were dismissed, including by the Alabama Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. In April 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court authorized his death warrant, scheduling execution for July 18, 2024. Gavin converted to Islam on death row and requested no autopsy in accordance with his religious beliefs, which the court granted. On July 18, 2024, 64 years old, Keith Edmund Gavin was executed by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility. His final words were, "I love my family," followed by Muslim prayers. He refused traditional last meals, consuming only ice cream and Mountain Dew. Number 10. Arthur Lee Burton. On July 29, 1997, in Houston, Texas, 48 years old, Nancy Edelman was abducted while jogging near her home. She did not return home that evening, and her body was discovered the following day in a wooded area along Brays Bayou. Edelman's shorts and underwear had been removed, and bruising indicated physical assault. A medical report confirmed that she had been choked with her own shoelaces. Arthur Lee Burton, born March 29, 1970, in Bastrop, Louisiana, grew up in a dysfunctional household. His father was largely absent, and he and his siblings sometimes lacked basic necessities. Burton began using hard substances at 16 and was involved in substance trafficking by age 17. At 18, he participated in 39 burglaries in 1 month. As an adult, Burton married and had 4 children, and relatives described him as a hard-working father and husband. 10 days after Edelman's murder, 27 years old, Burton was brought in for questioning by Deputy Sheriff Benjamin Bile. Initially denying involvement, Burton confessed after inconsistencies in his testimony were revealed. He admitted to kidnapping Edelman, attempting to assault her, and ultimately strangling her with her shoelaces. He later recanted, claiming the confession was coerced and citing intellectual disability. Burton was indicted on October 31, 1997 for capital murder. He stood trial in June 1998. Evidence presented showed Burton forced Edelman into a forested area, attempted and strangled her when she resisted. Burton maintained that his confession had been obtained under duress, but prosecutors noted that he provided details only the perpetrator would know. On June 23, 1998, Burton was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was formally sentenced on September 16, 1998. At that time, Burton's case drew attention as one of the high-profile executions in Harris County, which had seen 53 executions since 1976. Burton filed multiple appeals over the next decades. In March 2001, his conviction was affirmed, but his death sentence was vacated for resentencing. In September 2002, the death penalty was reinstated. Subsequent appeals to state and federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, were denied. Burton argued he was intellectually disabled, but assessments concluded his cognitive abilities were inconsistent with such a diagnosis. On May 1, 2024, a death warrant was authorized, scheduling execution for August 7, 2024. On that morning, 54 years old Arthur Lee Burton was executed via lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His final words were, "Bird is going home," and he also apologized to Edelman's family. Burton was pronounced dead at 6:47 p.m. He did not request a traditional last meal, instead consuming ice cream and soda from the prison snack bar prior. Number 11. Kevin Ray Underwood. Kevin Ray Underwood was born in Purcell, Oklahoma. People described him as a quiet and easygoing individual, but Underwood harbored dark fantasies that would eventually lead to a tragic event. On the 12th of April 2006, Underwood lured his 10-year-old neighbor, Jamie Rose Bolin, into his apartment under the pretense of showing her his pet rat. Once inside, he attacked her with a wooden cutting board, striking her multiple times on the back of the head. He then attempted to choke her, and after she died, he made efforts to dismember with a knife but was unsuccessful. Underwood wrapped the body in plastic sheeting and concealed it in a large plastic container in his closet. He also disassembled her bicycle to create the impression that she had left the apartment complex. When Jamie failed to return home, her father reported her missing, prompting a search that concluded on the 14th of April, 2006. Authorities, focusing on Underwood as a neighbor and potential last contact, obtained his consent to search his apartment. Initially calm, Underwood became visibly distressed when investigators noticed the sealed plastic container in his closet. Upon further questioning, he confessed, stating, "Go ahead and arrest me. She's in there. I hit her and chopped her up." He also admitted to harboring cannibalistic fantasies and had planned the crime for months. In February 2008, Underwood was tried for first-degree murder. On the 3rd of April 2008, the court formally sentenced Underwood to death after his videotape confession. After years of legal proceedings, Underwood was executed by lethal injection on the 19th of December 2024, the same day as his 45th birthday, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. In his final statement, he expressed remorse, saying, "I'm very sorry for what I did and I wish I could take it back." He also criticized the timing of his execution, calling it needlessly cruel to his family. He spent 6 years and 9 months on death row. Number 12. Joseph Edward Corcoran. On July 26, 1997, inside a residence on Gay Street in Fort Wayne, Indiana, 22-year-old Joseph Edward Corcoran committed the quadruple murder for which he was later sentenced to death. Corcoran lived in the home with his older brother James Corcoran, his sister Kelly Nieto, and her fiancé Robert Scott Turner, though his sister was away at a nearby store during the incident. His background included strained family relations dating back to his teenage years, including his earlier indictment and later acquittal in the deaths of his parents when he was nearly 17 years old. After dropping out of high school at 17, he moved between jobs and lived intermittently with siblings. By his early 20s, he had begun collecting firearms and isolating himself socially. On the day of the murders, James Corcoran, Robert Turner, and their friends Timothy Bricker and Douglas Stillwell were in the living room, watching television and eating pizza. From an upstairs room, Joseph reportedly believed they were discussing his alleged involvement in the 1992 deaths of his parents. Before confronting them, he moved his 7-year-old niece to a bedroom to keep her away from the gunfire. He then loaded a semi-automatic rifle, descended the stairs, and shot James, Turner, and Bricker at close range. Stillwell attempted to flee but was shot outside the doorway. Corcoran walked to a neighbor's house and asked them to call the police. Responding officers found the 4 men dead and recovered numerous firearms stored in their attic. 2 days later, Corcoran was arraigned on 4 counts of murder. His trial began in Allen County Superior Court, where a jury found him guilty in May 1999 and unanimously recommended the death penalty. Judge Fran Gull imposed 4 death sentences in August 1999. Corcoran remained mostly quiet during sentencing and showed little emotion. His attorneys later stated he believed the men in the living room intended to harm him. Over the next 24 years, Corcoran resided on death row at Indiana State Prison, filing multiple appeals that moved through the Indiana Supreme Court, the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court. His death sentences were overturned and reinstated several times, but all appeals were exhausted by July 2016. In September 2024, the Indiana Supreme Court issued a death warrant scheduling his execution. Corcoran declined to sign a clemency petition, telling the court he accepted responsibility. Joseph Corcoran was executed by single-drug pentobarbital lethal injection on December 18, 2024, after approximately 25 years on death row. His final meal request was fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and pie, and his last words were reported as, "I'm sorry."
Before we continue, what country or state are you watching from? Leave a comment below. Thank you.
Number 13. Christopher Leroy Collings. On the 3rd of November 2007, in Stella, Missouri, 9-year-old Rowan Ford, then a 4th-grade student, was last seen at her home before she disappeared. Her mother, Colleen Munson, was unable to find her, and hence, Ford was reported missing. The police, as well as the FBI, conducted a large-scale search for the girl, but Ford remained unfound. Few days after her disappearance, Ford's body was found in a cave at McDonald County, Missouri, and forensic reports showed that Ford had been abused and strangled to death. She had injuries around her neck and around her lower body parts. Following police investigations, the police arrested 2 suspects. One of them was 5-year-old David Wesley Spears, who was Ford's stepfather, while the other was Spears's friend, 2-year-old Christopher Leroy Collings. Prior to the murder, Collings had previously lived with Ford's family for several months. Collings slept in the basement, and Ford affectionately looked up to him as Uncle Chris, and Collings grew fond of the girl. During the investigation, both men confessed to the crime. Collings, after drinking a lot on the day of the crime, abducted Ford and took her to the back of his trailer where he attacked her, and when he planned to return her back home, the little girl saw his face and he got scared and decided to murder her to avoid being implicated. Afterwards, he disposed of the body. After the confession, Collings was arrested and charged with murder and was convicted and sentenced to death. On the 3rd of December 2024, 9-year-old Christopher Leroy Collings was put to death by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center. Number 14. Carrie Dale Grayson. Carrie Dale Grayson was 19 years old on February 21, 1994, when the crime occurred in a remote area of Blount County, Alabama. Grayson and 3 other teenagers encountered 37-year-old hitchhiker Vicki DeBlue near Birmingham as she traveled toward her mother's home in Louisiana. Grayson, born in Jefferson County in 1975, had a troubled background marked by early substance use, unstable living conditions, and behavioral problems throughout his teenage years. After offering DeBlue a ride, the group drove her to a wooded location off Highway 75. According to trial records, the teenagers began assaulting her without provocation. DeBlue was beaten, stomped, and struck repeatedly until she lost consciousness. Grayson and the others then carried her to the edge of a cliff and pushed her over. When they returned later that night, they further hurt her body in an attempt to hinder identification. No one at the scene survived except the 4 perpetrators, and there were no witnesses aside from the co-defendants who later provided statements. Grayson was arrested within days. He was charged with 2 counts of capital murder, murder during a kidnapping, and murder during a robbery. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease, citing a history of emotional instability, but the jury rejected the defense. In 1996, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Because he was over 18 at the time of the offense, he remained eligible for capital punishment, while the 3 younger co-defendants later had their death sentences set aside after the United States Supreme Court barred executions of juveniles. During sentencing, Grayson showed little reaction as the death verdict was read. He later claimed that his actions had been driven by immaturity and substance use, though he did not deny his involvement. Over the next 29 years, he filed appeals arguing improper jury instructions, ineffective counsel, and that nitrogen hypoxia constituted cruel punishment. All petitions were denied. He remained incarcerated at Holman Correctional Facility, spending nearly 3 decades on death row. On November 21, 2024, at age 50, Grayson was executed by nitrogen hypoxia at Holman. Witnesses stated that when asked for final words, he responded with an obscenity and raised both middle fingers. Number 15. Richard Bernard Moore. Richard Bernard Moore, born in Detroit, Michigan, was executed for the murder of James Mahoney on September 16, 1999, at Nicky's convenience store in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Moore was 34 years old at the time of the crime. He grew up in Detroit and struggled with substance abuse and criminal behavior, including burglary and weapons offenses during the 1,980 seconds. In 1991, he relocated with his partner, Linda Bird, to Spartanburg, South Carolina, where they later had 2 children. Moore had a history of violent offenses, including assaults on Michelle Crowder and other Spartanburg residents, stemming from his ongoing drug addiction. On the morning of September 16, 1999, Moore entered Nicky's convenience store intending to commit a robbery to support his habit. Inside were the store clerk, 42-year-old James Mahoney, and Terry Haddon, who was playing on a video poker machine. A confrontation ensued when Mahoney challenged Moore. In the scuffle, Moore wrested a firearm from Mahoney. He attempted to shoot Haddon, who feigned death on the floor, while Mahoney retrieved a second gun and exchanged gunfire with Moore. Moore shot Mahoney in the chest, and Mahoney fired at Moore, striking his arm. Moore fled the store after taking $1,408 and accidentally backed his pickup truck into a telephone pole about 1.5 miles from the scene. Deputy Bobby Rollins apprehended Moore at the truck, and the stolen money and Mahoney's firearm were recovered. Mahoney died shortly after from his injuries. Moore was charged with murder, armed robbery, assault with intent to kill, and firearms violations. He initially pleaded not guilty but later changed his plea to guilty in 2018 after dismissing his attorneys, acknowledging responsibility for Mahoney's death. During his trial in October 2001, Moore claimed self-defense, arguing he did not bring a weapon into the store. The jury found him guilty on all counts and recommended a death sentence, which was formally imposed on October 22, 2001. Following years on death row at Broad River Correctional Institution, Moore's execution was repeatedly delayed due to challenges with lethal injection drugs and questions about execution methods, including firing squad and electrocution. In October 24, Moore selected lethal injection for his execution. On November 1, 24, at age 59, Richard Bernard Moore was executed by lethal injection at Broad River Correctional Institution. In his final statement, he expressed remorse and acknowledged his wrongdoing. His last meal included steak cooked medium, fried catfish and shrimp, scalloped potatoes, green peas, broccoli with cheese, sweet potato pie, German chocolate cake, and grape juice. Number 16. Derek Ryan Dearman. Derek Ryan Dearman, born in Leakesville, Mississippi, was executed for the killings of 5 people on August 20, 2016, at a home near Citronelle, Alabama, approximately 30 miles north of Mobile. Dearman was 27 years old at the time of the crimes. Raised in Mississippi, he struggled with substance abuse and severe mental health issues, including bipolar disorder with psychotic features, which worsened following periods of sleep deprivation and drug use. The attack occurred after Dearman's estranged girlfriend, Lynetta Lester, had sought refuge at the home of her brother, Joseph Adam Turner, due to prior incidents of abuse. On the night of August 19th into the early morning of August 20th, Dearman arrived at the residence multiple times, demanding to see Lester, and was denied entry. After 3 a.m., he returned while the occupants were asleep. Dearman entered the house and attacked Shannon Melissa Randall, 35, Joseph Adam Turner, 26, Robert Lee Brown, 26, Justin Caleb Reed, 23, and Chelsea Marie Reed, 22, who was 5 months pregnant. Using an axe found in the yard and a firearm taken from the home, Dearman murdered all 5 victims. He abducted Lester and a child from the house and transported them to Leakesville, Mississippi, where he released them, prompting Lester to alert authorities. Dearman surrendered to police in Greene County, Mississippi, following intervention from his father. He was extradited to Alabama and charged with 6 counts of capital murder, including 1 for the unborn child, and 2 counts of abduction. Initially pleading not guilty, he later dismissed his attorneys, changed his plea to guilty in 2018, and waived all appeals, requesting execution. The jury had unanimously recommended a death sentence, and Dearman expressed remorse, acknowledging that his hard substance use and mental illness contributed to the crimes. He was held on death row at Holman Correctional Facility for 6 years. During sentencing, Dearman accepted responsibility and addressed the families of the victims, stating, "Forgive me. This is not for me. This is for you," and expressed love for his own family. He attributed his actions to hard substance use at the time, acknowledging that it had distorted his perception. On October 17, 24, at age 36, Derek Ryan Dearman was executed by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility, Alabama. His final statement included the words, "I am truly sorry. I know an apology doesn't suffice, but I hope you can find some peace." Number 17. Garcia Glenn White. Garcia Glenn White, born in Houston, Texas, was convicted of the murders of Bonita Edwards and her twin 16-year-old daughters, Burnett and Annette, on November 30, 1989, in Northeast Houston. White was 26 years old at the time of the killings. Raised in a large family, White attended Wheatley High School, where he played football, before briefly studying at Lubbock Christian University. A knee injury ended his athletic aspirations, and he subsequently worked in menial jobs as a fry cook, house painter, and sandblaster. During this period, he developed a hard substance addiction that contributed to increasingly violent behavior. On the night of November 30th, White visited Edwards' apartment, intending to use a substance and engage in sexual activity. When Bonita Edwards refused, White became aggressive, producing a knife and stabbing her multiple times. Her daughters, alarmed by the commotion, went to investigate. White then entered the bedroom, assaulted Annette, and attacked her in the chest and slashed her. He proceeded to the bathroom and similarly attacked Burnett. After murdering all three, he partially covered Annette with a blanket and obstructed Burnett's airway with a towel before leaving the apartment. The victims' bodies were discovered on December 2nd by Bonita's boyfriend, King Solomon, who had become concerned after failing to locate them. White remained unidentified for 6 years. In July 1995, he was arrested for the murder of a convenience store clerk, Hai Van Pham, during a failed robbery. During interrogation, an acquaintance informed authorities that White had confessed to the Edwards murders. Initially denying involvement, White later admitted to murdering all three victims after investigators disproved a false story he had fabricated, implicating another individual. DNA and serology tests confirmed his presence at the crime scene. On May 28, 1996, White was indicted for the murders of Burnett and Annette, and was subsequently sentenced to death. White repeatedly appealed his sentence, challenging the legitimacy of his videotaped confession, the DNA evidence, and citing his traumatic upbringing and low intelligence. Each appeal was denied, and his execution was ultimately scheduled for October 1, 24. White spent nearly 30 years on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky Unit in West Livingston, Texas. On October 1, 24, at age 61, he was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville Unit. Before his death, he made no public statements beyond acknowledging his sentence. Number 18. Alan Eugene Miller. Alan Eugene Miller, born in the United States, was involved in the murders of 3 men on August 5, 1999, in Pelham, Alabama. At the time, Miller was 34 years old. On that day, Miller, employed as a delivery truck driver at Ferguson Enterprises, entered the premises of a heating and air conditioning distributor armed with a .40 caliber Glock pistol. He shot and murdered 2 co-workers, 32-year-old Lee Holdbrooks and 28-year-old Christopher Yancey. Holdbrooks was shot 6 times and Yancey 3 times. Following this, Miller drove approximately 5 miles to a business where he had previously worked and shot his former supervisor, 39-year-old Terry Jarvis, 5 times. After the shootings, Miller fled the scene but was apprehended later the same day on an Alabama highway. 4 police officers required 4 sets of handcuffs to subdue him. During his trial, it was suggested that Miller's motive was his belief that the 3 men were spreading rumors about his sexual orientation. A psychiatrist retained by Miller's defense described him as suffering from severe mental illness. Miller was charged with 3 counts of capital murder and related offenses. His trial concluded in 2000, resulting in a death sentence for the murders. During sentencing, Miller's behavior was reportedly uncooperative, though he maintained that he had not committed the killings. He appealed his sentence on multiple occasions, and in September 2022, his initial execution by lethal injection was halted due to unsuccessful attempts to establish intravenous access. Following this failed execution, Miller filed a federal lawsuit, and the state of Alabama later decided to execute him using nitrogen hypoxia instead of lethal injection. On September 26, 2024, at age 59, Allen Eugene Miller was executed at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. Witnesses noted that Miller struggled briefly during the procedure, shaking and pulling at his restraints for approximately 2 minutes. His final meal consisted of a hamburger steak, baked potato, and French fries. His last words were, "I didn't do anything to be in here." Miller spent 25 years on death row at Holman Correctional Facility. Number 19. Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn. Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn, born in Oklahoma, United States, was involved in the murder of convenience store owner Kenneth Mears on June 19, 1992, in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. At the time of the crime, Littlejohn was 20 years old. The incident occurred at Mears's store around 10:15 p.m., where Mears, aged 31, was working alongside 2 employees, Tony Hulsey and Danny Waldrop. Littlejohn, accompanied by Glenroy Bethany, then 25, entered the store intending to commit armed robbery. Both men were indebted to a gang dealer and sought cash to repay the debt. During the robbery, Mears was held at gunpoint. Witness accounts conflicted over who fired the fatal shot, with Hulsey claiming Littlejohn held the gun, while outside witnesses suggested Bethany, based on height and appearance. Regardless, Mears was shot in the face and died. Littlejohn fled for approximately 5 days before being apprehended in Wichita, Kansas, and extradited to Oklahoma. Bethany was arrested earlier and later sentenced to life without parole. Littlejohn also faced separate charges for robbery with a dangerous weapon, 2 counts of first-degree rape, and kidnapping alongside William Arnold Penny. Littlejohn's trial began in early 1994 in Oklahoma County District Court. He maintained his innocence regarding the murder, asserting that Bethany was the shooter, though he admitted involvement in the robbery. On November 15, 1994, Littlejohn was found guilty of murder, robbery, and attempted robbery. 3 days later, the jury sentenced him to death, also imposing 300 years for robbery and 99 years for attempted robbery. On November 23, 1994, the sentence was formally imposed by District Judge Charles L. Owens. Littlejohn spent 3 decades appealing his sentence, consistently claiming innocence in Mears's shooting. On September 26, 2024, at age 52, Emmanuel Antonia Littlejohn was executed by lethal injection at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Prior to execution, he requested meat pizza, Coca-Cola, and 2 slices of cheesecake as his final meal. Littlejohn's last words were directed to his mother and daughter. "Everything is going to be okay. I love you." Littlejohn spent 32 years on death row, remaining incarcerated at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Number 20. Travis James Mullis. Travis James Mullis, born in Maryland, United States, committed the murder of his son, Elijah James Mullis, on January 29, 2008, in Galveston County, Texas. At the time, Mullis was 21 years old. The victim, Elijah, was discovered dead along Seawall Boulevard by a married couple, Jesse and Emeralda Zaro, while searching for wildlife. Mullis was orphaned at approximately 10 months old when his mother died, and his father had abandoned the family. He was adopted by his uncle and aunt, Gary and Ann Mullis, and grew up in Abingdon, Maryland. From a young age, Mullis was abused by his adoptive father, who was later convicted and incarcerated for these crimes. Beginning at age 4, Mullis received psychiatric treatment for severe psychological issues, including homicidal behavior. He experienced auditory hallucinations and flashbacks related to his childhood abuse, which contributed to subsequent offenses. At 13, Mullis was caught attacking his 8-year-old cousin and sent to the Jefferson School for Emotionally Troubled Juveniles, where he remained until age 17. He later moved to Texas and lived with hip girlfriend Karen Koberger, with whom he had Elijah. On January 29, 2008, after an argument with Koberger, Mullis drove with Elijah in the back seat and assaulted the boy. When he cried, Mullis choked him and hit on his head multiple times, causing fatal fractures. He disposed of the body along the roadside. Mullis fled Texas for 3 days before surrendering to police in Philadelphia on February 1st, where he confessed to the murder. Koberger was later charged with child endangerment for placing Elijah in Mullis's care despite knowledge of his psychiatric history. Mullis stood trial in Galveston County on March 7, 2011. During the trial, his videotaped confession was presented, in which he admitted to murdering Elijah to stop the him from crying and expressed remorse for his actions. The jury reached a verdict on March 11th, finding Mullis guilty of capital murder. During sentencing, the court considered the prior offenses and the circumstances of Mullis's childhood. The defense requested life imprisonment without parole, citing Mullis's abusive upbringing and psychological trauma, while the prosecution sought the death penalty. On March 21, 2011, the jury unanimously sentenced Mullis to death. Mullis repeatedly waived his appeals and stated he wished to be executed, though he later filed limited federal appeals, which were denied. In May 2024, his death warrant was issued, scheduling execution for September 24, 2024. Mullis was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville Unit on that date, 4 days after his 38th birthday. His final meal included chicken wings and tater tots. His last words were an apology to his son's mother and family and gratitude to prison staff for rehabilitative opportunities. Travis James Mullis spent 16 years on death row. Number 21. Marcellus Scott Williams. Marcellus Scott Williams, born in South Bend, Indiana, committed the crime for which he was ultimately executed on August 11, 1998, in University City, Missouri. At the time, Williams was 29 years old. He was charged with the first-degree murder of Felicia Ann Gale, a 42-year-old journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who was found attacked 43 times in her home during a burglary. Williams grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, after moving there at the age of 5 with his mother and 2 brothers. His childhood was marked by poverty, exposure to alcohol, drugs, and firearms, and repeated physical and emotional abuse. His parents abandoned him, and criminal behavior ran in the family. By the time he was an adult, Williams had accumulated 16 prior convictions, including burglary, assault, robbery, and unlawful use of weapons. He had become a father and married a single mother, but the death of his older brother in 1997 profoundly affected him. That same year, he was incarcerated for armed robbery. On August 11, 1998, Gale was discovered in her home by her husband around 8 p.m. Her body showed multiple stab wounds, including to her neck, back, and thigh, and defensive injuries to her hands and arms. Her purse, jacket, and her husband's Macintosh computer were stolen. Initial investigations found physical evidence at the scene inconclusive. However, Williams' former cellmate, Henry Cole, and his girlfriend, Laura Asaro, testified that Williams had confessed to the crime and provided details not publicly known. Stolen items, including a laptop, were recovered from individuals connected to Williams, forming part of the prosecution's evidence. Williams was convicted of first-degree murder in August 2001 and sentenced to death. During sentencing, he was held accountable for his prior convictions, and the brutality of the crime was cited as an aggravating factor. Williams maintained his innocence throughout his appeals, which included arguments regarding evidentiary rulings, jury instructions, and DNA evidence. Multiple appeals were rejected, though a scheduled execution in August 2017 was stayed for review of DNA evidence, later found to belong to a prosecutor who mishandled the murder weapon. Williams spent over 23 years on death row at Potosi Correctional Center, studying Islam, writing poetry, and mentoring fellow inmates. He accepted an Alford plea in August 24 to vacate his death sentence, but the Missouri Supreme Court blocked the plea and his execution proceeded. On September 24, 2024, Williams, aged 55, was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. His final meal consisted of chicken wings and tater tots, and his last words were, "All praise be to Allah in every situation." Number 22. Freddie Eugene Owens. Freddie Eugene Owens, also known as Khalil Divine Black Sun Allah, was involved in a fatal crime on November 1, 1997, at a convenience store in Greenville, South Carolina. Owens, who was 19 years old at the time, and an 18-year-old accomplice, Stephen Andra Golden, entered the store with the intention of committing armed robbery. Lester Young and Nakeo Vance, friends of Owens, were present nearby but did not enter the store. Inside, Owens and Golden confronted Irene Granger Graves, a 41-year-old clerk. When Graves failed to open the safe, Owens shot her in the head, causing her death. Owens and Golden left the store with $37.29. Graves was survived by 3 children, who were left in the care of their grandmother. Owens was arrested on November 11, 1997, and charged with murder, along with Golden, who later pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Owens denied the killing during his trial but was identified in store surveillance footage, wearing a ski mask while committing the shooting. On February 8, 1999, Owens was convicted of murder, armed robbery, criminal use of firearms, and conspiracy to commit armed robbery. 12 hours after his conviction, Owens murdered a fellow prisoner, 28-year-old Christopher Brian Lee, while incarcerated. Owens attacked Lee following taunts about his conviction, using a ballpoint pen, a sheet for strangulation, and a cigarette lighter to inflict severe injuries. Owens confessed to the killing during his sentencing hearing on February 17, 1999. The jury sentenced him to death for Graves's murder, with additional prison terms for the other charges. The second murder charge for Lee was later withdrawn. Owens's death sentence was overturned twice due to procedural errors, but was reinstated in 2 subsequent resentencing trials in 2003 and 2006. He remained on death row at Broad River Correctional Institution, converting to Islam during this period and adopting the name Khalil Divine Black Sun Allah. Owens engaged in reading, writing, and studying African history while incarcerated. Multiple appeals and clemency petitions, including claims that his accomplice had falsely identified him as the shooter, were rejected. On September 20, 2024, at the age of 46, Owens was executed by lethal injection at Broad River Correctional Institution. He declined a formal final statement, saying only "bye" to his attorney. His final meal consisted of 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, a well-done ribeye steak, 6 chicken wings, 2 strawberry sodas, and a slice of apple pie. Number 23. Loran Kensley Cole. On February 18, 1994, in Ocala National Forest, Florida, 18 years old John Timothy Edwards was murdered, and his 21-year-old sister, Pam Edwards, was kidnapped and assaulted. The siblings had met for a camping trip. John drove from Tallahassee, and Pam arrived from St. Petersburg. While setting up camp at Hopkins Prairie, they were approached by a man identifying himself as Kevin, who offered assistance and introduced his companion as his brother. Both men stayed at the campsite until late evening. During a walk toward a pond to photograph alligators, Kevin attacked Pam, restraining her, while Loran Kensley Cole assaulted John, slashing him and inflicting fatal injuries. Pam was then taken back to the campsite, assaulted twice over the following day, gagged, tied, and her possessions were stolen. She freed herself 2 days later, while John's body was found by law enforcement on the same day. Lauren Kensley Cole was born November 11, 1966, in Iowa. He experienced an abusive and neglectful childhood, with alcoholic parents and repeated placements in foster care. At 17, he was sent to the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, where he endured physical and abuse, including beatings and broken legs during an attempted escape. Prior to the Edwards case, Cole had a criminal record including theft, burglary, and grand theft, and had been released on parole in 1991 after serving 1 year of a 5.5-year sentence. Cole was arrested shortly after the attack, along with his accomplice, William Christopher Paul, and charged with murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of assault, and 2 counts of armed robbery. Cole was identified as the primary assailant in the murder of John Edwards. His trial began in late September 1995, and the 12-member jury found him guilty on all charges. On December 21, 1995, he was sentenced to death for the murder and life imprisonment for the remaining charges. His attorneys emphasized his abusive upbringing, but the court determined his actions were deliberate and violent. Cole filed multiple appeals over the years, citing abuse at Dozier School and Parkinson's disease as factors that might warrant clemency, but all were denied. He spent nearly 30 years on death row at Florida State Prison in Ryford. On August 29, 2024, 57 years old, Cole was executed by lethal injection. His last meal included pizza, M&Ms, ice cream, and soda. He declined to make a final statement, saying simply, "No, sir." Number 24. Tabaron Dave Honey. On July 9, 1998, in Cedar City, Utah, 49 years old, Claudia Marie Ben was murdered in her home. Ben, a substance abuse counselor and caregiver, was the mother of Carol Pikyavit, who had previously dated Tabaron Dave Honey. At the time, Honey and Pikyavit had a child together. After their breakup, Pikyavit had moved in with her mother. Tabaron Dave Honey, born October 29, 1975, was a Native American from the Hopi tribe. He grew up in poverty and reported first using alcohol at 5 years old. His attorneys later noted multiple head injuries and traumatic events in his childhood, including a fall from approximately 30 feet as a teenager. On the evening of July 9, 1998, Honey called Pikyavit, demanding she visit him immediately and threatening to harm her family. Pikyavit left for work, and later that evening, Honey broke into the home she shared with Ben by shattering a sliding glass door. Ben attempted to defend herself with a kitchen knife, but Honey overpowered her. He slashed her 4 times, deep enough to reach her backbone, and inflicted additional stab wounds. Police arrived in the early hours of the following day after a 911 call from a neighbor. They found Ben's body partially unclothed, with Honey hiding in the garage. He was arrested on site with blood residue on his fingertips and immediately admitted, stating, "I attacked her. I murdered her with a knife." 3 young granddaughters, one of whom was his daughter, were also found in the home, covered in blood, and one had been assaulted. Honey was charged with aggravated murder, burglary, and abject assault. He waived his right to a jury and opted for a bench trial. On May 20, 1999, Honey was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Over the following decades, he filed multiple appeals citing inadequate legal defense, fetal alcohol syndrome, and brain injury from his teenage fall, all of which were denied by state and federal courts, including the Utah Supreme Court. In the final months before his execution, Honey petitioned for clemency and requested a reprieve from Utah's parole board. At the hearing, he expressed remorse, stating, "Yes, I'm a monster. The only thing that kept me going all these years. I make no excuses." His requests were denied. On August 8, 2024, 48 years old, Honey was executed by lethal injection at the Utah State Correctional Facility. His last meal consisted of a cheeseburger, French fries, and a milkshake. In his final statement, he said, "From the start, it's been, if it needs to be done for the victims' families to heal, let's do this. I love you all. Take care." As of November 2025, Tabaron Dave Honey is deceased. having served 26 years in prison, including 25 years on death row, before execution by lethal injection. Thank you for watching. Check out these other interesting clips from the channel, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.